I'm Mark Hennick, and this is Modern Minds Rewind. Here's my conversation with Dr. Upali Nanda. Dr. Nanda, thank you so much for joining me on the Modern Minds podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Mark.
Now, you've done a significant amount of work and research, especially early on in your career, in the area of visual art and healthcare spaces. So since on this episode, we're talking about healing spaces, about recovery-oriented architecture, I'm hoping that you can talk to me a little bit about the visual art angle. What is the role that visual art can play within healthcare settings in terms of impacting people's mental health and well-being?
Thank you for that question, Mark. When we think about art, in some ways, it's a portal to the soul. Like there's a resonance that we as humans have with art that it doesn't meet any functional need per se, but it meets a very inherent human need for us. And in my research early on in my career, I have to confess that I myself was amazed at how much of a difference it makes. So I started my research right after my doctorate on sensory design with a company called American Art Resources. And there we investigated for many years the impact of art on stress, on anxiety, just how people thought about art. And small story, I remember being a very fresh graduate, going into an oncology center, surrounded by patients, and I was doing this project on art. And I said, I can't do it. I can't step in there and ask people, what do you think about the art? I mean, they have such huge battles, health battles that they're fighting right now. How am I going to ask them this question around art? And what was fascinating is they loved it. The patients loved it. The patients loved speaking about something other than their health and their medication and their recovery. They loved speaking about art. And they told me stories about, every time I come in, I sit in this waiting room and I see that piece and it speaks this story to me. And that becomes their anchor in this very, very unstable, uncertain world.
Mm.
Um,
Now,
and
do you mind if I ask you some questions while you're going here? Because I don't want
of
to
course.
miss anything. This is such a new area for me. But as somebody who, I appreciate art myself as a casual observer, but there's so much here in terms of the connection to psychology, I think, that fascinates
Mhm.
me. Art is I'm inclined to say notoriously subjective, but it's not a bad thing. It's inherent in art that it's supposed to be subjective. So what kind of considerations are given, especially in healthcare kind of settings, to what quote unquote good art is, or healing art, or the selections that are put in those spaces?
I think the distinction between those two words is vital: good art versus healing art.
Mm-hmm.
And it's also important to understand from whose perspective. Art is so much about perception, but the key point to remember in art is that literally the brain that I'm taking, the perceptual lens that I'm taking when I'm viewing art in a museum or a gallery is different from when I'm viewing art in a lobby or a waiting area, and it's different from when I'm viewing art in a ICU or a critical care space, or when I'm bedridden and confined to my bed. The perceptual context matters. So when we say good art or bad art, when we say healing art, healing in what context, for what level of vulnerability? In health, the first rule is first do no harm. And so the more vulnerable the patient, the more careful you are about not putting art that might agitate them, because it is and can be so subjective. There's a beautiful term in art which is called the beholder's share.
Mm-hmm.
Any piece of art has a component which is the beholder's share. I have to engage with it. I have to understand it. I have to engage and comprehend what the artist was intending. When you're highly stressed and highly anxious, you are not able to do your beholder's share the same way. The beholder
Mhm.
in this context has a burden.
Mhm.
Um, a theoretical framework that can help us is emotional congruence. So I can see the same piece of art. Let's take a very abstract piece, a very subjective piece. I see that art when I'm happy and I engage with it differently. I will see different things in it. I see that same piece of art when I'm highly vulnerable, when physiologically and psychologically I'm facing huge battles,
Mhm.
internal, visible, invisible scars. I will see something different in it. And that is why, in very vulnerable populations, healing art is art that it tends to be more nature based, more familiar, non threatening. The purpose at that end of the spectrum is to really just calm you down.
Mhm. Mhm.
If it's in a place where you have a choice, where your stress levels are lower, art has a different purpose. It could be to excite you, to
Mhm.
engage you, to get you to think about something different. Sometimes the
E-
purpose of art is humor,
to challenge
right?
or provoke you, even. Yeah.
Exactly, to challenge and provoke you. So it's a different purpose. And understanding at what point how vulnerable we are and what is the purpose of art, that's essential. And that
Mhm.
is what defines good art. It's good art becomes healing art when it is the right fit for the emotional context that it's in.
Yeah. I once had I had an idea a few years back in my condo to frame a few plates from the thematic apperception test, which is an
Mhm.
old Rorschach style, or in the vein of projective tests. You've got a
Yeah.
lonely and dejected-looking little boy sitting in a doorway, and an overbearing-looking mother. These sorts of black and white, vague images. So I framed a few of them, and I had them up in my living room because they spurred the most interesting conversations with guests who came over because
Sure.
that's the point, right? Then I realized maybe these people weren't prepared to be blindsided by armchair psychoanalysis when they came over for dinner. But anyway, it was an interesting exercise in how much of ourselves we project onto the art, right? And then
Absolutely.
use it as an interpretive tool.
Absolutely. And I'll give you an example from a research study that we did a study in an East Alabama hospital, which was in a psych holding room. It was one of those rooms that was windowless, that had nothing, like blank walls. And all we did was rotate a piece of art over a period of a few weeks. So we had a copy of Van Gogh, one of the Sunflower series. We had a Jackson Pollock, which of course was very agitating in what you might perhaps perceive from it. And then we had a very simple photograph. We had a photograph of this biophilic image with prospect and refuge and a lot of things that, from a primal evolutionary perspective, would resonate. And what we measured over time was behavior of those in the holding room while they were waiting for a diagnosis, as well as the PRN medication, which is the as needed medication for anxiety and signs of aggression. It was fascinating that behaviorally, with the Pollock, patients actually went up and they turned it around because they did not want to look at it. So they were oriented, they would change the orientation. Some of them turned it around.
Hmm.
We didn't see any visible signs with the Van Gogh, which was highly impressionistic but nature based.
Mhm.
And then we had that nature photograph. But when we looked at the medication data, they requested significantly lower as needed anxiety and aggression medication during the time this biophilic nature image was put on the wall, compared to both the Pollock and the Van Gogh. And of course, these
Fascinating.
are not originals. Uh, these are copies, and this was published in the Journal of Mental Health. And I'm happy to share a link. Um, it made two or three very interesting cases. One,
Mm.
you were able to talk about art instead of pills because there was medication, and the amount of medication that you were giving out on an as needed basis for Inetta, that was reduced. So first of all, there immediately became a link to health outcomes and business outcomes. You could actually save money by putting healing art on the walls. The second thing that was fascinating is how they responded to just the impressionism, the heavy strokes. And I remember talking to a psychiatrist friend of mine, and he said, well, if you're really agitated, you will see the agitation in those strokes. And that agitation is what makes it a great piece of art. But I can imagine that if I myself am feeling highly stressed, if I'm agitated, my resonance with that painting, it makes me more agitated rather than calm.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
Right? So again, a really interesting, like that study, I wouldn't project those findings to something outside of a psych holding room, for example,
Mm-hmm.
or a space where you have very, very vulnerable patients, right? So that context that we were talking about becomes so important. But just think about this for a second. For us to be able to say that simply having healing art on the walls reduced the amount of anxiety medication that had to
Mm-hmm.
be given. And when we talk about medication, the way the hospital calculates the time is that it's the cost of the medication, the time of the pharmacist, the time of the nurse. Like what you're actually charged for one medication is way more than the cost of a pill.
Mm-hmm.
It's all of that that comes into it. And you sit back and say, wherever I am, any given point in time, you're somewhere. You're placed in some context. Your environment is part of you. To what extent are we leveraging the power of art and the power of place for healing?
Mm. Well, connected to that, and maybe bridging a little bit into architecture as art, what the space
Mhm.
actually looks like. Some of my most vivid memories of myself being on psych wards were of the cinder block walls and of the bolts and how they didn't have mirrors; they just had shiny metal. So all of those things contributed to if you've never experienced depression, it's like it's an internal oppression of yourself. And then when you're in an environment that is itself oppressive, it's like it's reinforcing the depression. So, what have you noticed in terms of the artistic design of the space, architecturally speaking, in terms of the impact on mental health?
Some of the recent work we've done on the HKS side with research on this is to try to take this narrative beyond safety to security and dignity. And that becomes so important. I think we get really mired to just keep them safe first, physically safe from doing harm, and forget about how much this environment might psychologically continue to create damage. So, a lot of the work that's happening right now, you will not see those clinical spaces anymore, hopefully, not in a lot of projects that are intentionally designed. Art is infused into it. You have to have safety in place. So, you may not have glass, but there are murals that could be used. You could use canvas. There is so much innovation that has happened so that these environments can become health promoting. And there's a
Mm.
difference in that. Like, even our paradigm right now, we're talking about brain health. We're talking about taking care of your brains the way you take care of your bodies. To really understand, like, not wait till you've reached a point where you have a mental health crisis and constantly design environments that are promoting mental health. And art is a huge part of that. Nature is a huge part of that. If you look at how we engage with art, there are three components of it. One, which is expressing through art, that is art therapy. There is so much beautiful work that is happening in this space on the act of creating art makes me feel better. Then there's art as experience, and sometimes it's targeted experience, places I can go to intentionally, go to galleries, to areas, to well designed rooms, perhaps sensory rooms in hospitals where I get the experience that helps me recreate the context I'm in. And then there's art, and often visual art falls there, that is just part of your environment, that changes the tenor of the environment, that tells you that this place matters. You matter. Another very interesting study we did years ago was with an emergency department, which catered to a lot of homeless population. Like it was one of those waiting rooms that sees 100,000 patients a year. And of course, it had the typical gang chairs, and it had terribly boring walls. And all we did this tiny, tiny intervention. All we did was put some canvas out on the walls and put some imagery on the TV screen. We didn't take all the TV programming out, but we took some of it out. And you know what was fascinating, Mark, is we did a study. We found a lot of good indicators in terms of restless behaviors reduced, complaints to the staff reduced. But what to me was most fascinating is noise levels reduced. People became quieter. They were not shouting as much as each other. And your volume is an indicator of stress. And I was fascinated by that, saying we did nothing. We did nothing in terms of the auditory stimuli. All we did, but what it did, and this was a staff member who said it, saying when you put art on the walls, it told us we matter. It told the patients they matter, that this is a place of beauty. It's a place of healing. It's not a place where you check in and check out and we're just trying to get you on your way. And there's something about the act of engaging with art and the inclusion of art that changes the tenor of a place. And some of it, objectively, as a researcher, we can quantify, and some of it is beautifully qualitative and should always stay so.
But it makes it changes the narrative from being a car repair shop for your brain into something where you actually grow and flourish. I love that.
That's a beautiful analogy. It's not a repair shop. It's a place that you go to nurture yourself.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Nanda, thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your depth of expertise with us on the show today. It's really been a pleasure speaking with you.
Likewise. Thank you so much for reaching out.
Thank you for revisiting this conversation with me on Modern Minds Rewind. You can listen, watch, and subscribe to the show on YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and wherever else you get your podcasts. You can also stay in touch with me at Mark Henick, that's at MarkHenick, on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, Instagram, and X. Until next time, I've been Mark Henick, host of the Modern Minds podcast for the Hartford Healthcare Behavioral Health Network.